We hope everybody's took a quick break, is back. So we're going to transition to our second presentation, in which we're joined by two representatives from the New England Forestry Foundation. With a lot of us have been excited about the terrific work that the organization has been doing in recent years on exemplary forestry and the role of forests in addressing climate change and carbon issues. And today we're joined by Alec Giffin, who's the Senior Forest Science and Policy Fellow, and Jennifer Shakun, the Climate Forestry Specialist with NEFF. And they're going to talk about exemplary forestry in Southern New England and tying it to our cities. Certainly, there's been a lot of interest in the forestry standards that NEFF has developed for the Acadian Forest region to our north. And now we're going to learn more about what this looks like for the region that those of us who live and work in the Yankee division are in. Thanks so much for being with us here today. And Alec and Jen, if you're out there, I hand this over to you.
Okay, great, Chris. Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to the Yankee division to talk about the work that we've been doing on defining exemplary forestry standards. And just to tell you what the flow of this presentation is going to be, I'm going to talk about the standards themselves, and then Jen is going to talk about the effort to tie better forestry with building with wood in New England's urban areas. I see also from the participants that Bob Purcell is with us, director, and Chris Pryor, who's head of forestry for NEFF, are also in the audience. So folks may have some questions for them as we go down the road here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the standards themselves. Let me start off by saying, why did NEFF undertake this enterprise? And the reason is because NEFF has to explain the kind of forestry that it wants to practice and practices on its own lands. So that's where these standards originated. We did the ones for the Acadian Forest first, even though NEFF doesn't own as much land in the Acadian Forest. We're working on that, but traditionally has not. But it was the region that I was most familiar with and had done a fair amount of thinking about. So we worked on that first, and then we moved on to the Central and Transition Hardwoods, where the circumstances are quite different. And it took us a fair amount of time to sort of unravel how to deal with the differences in those circumstances, which have not only to do with the species that are involved, but also the level of stocking that exists in the Central and Transition Hardwoods versus a good deal of the Acadian Forest. So Jen is going to handle the slides. So Jen, why don't we move to the first slide? So first of all, the exemplary forestry standards respect and are a complement to the effort to develop ecological reserves. I know that you're all familiar with the Wildlands and Woodlands report, and NEFF stands squarely behind the effort to develop a system of ecological reserves. But this set of standards is not for ecological reserves. It's for the actively managed portion of the forests that surround ecological reserves, of which NEFF has quite a selection of ecological reserves on its properties, but this is not about the management of ecological reserves. It's the management of actively managed forests. And I'm going to jump right to sort of the meat of this here. Jen, if we could go to slide number 20. So thinking about this presentation, I put it together thinking that I'd be using it again in the future and putting it together for more of a lay audience. but you guys all being foresters, I wanted to jump right to what's the essence of this, and then I'll go through the rest of the slides afterwards. So first of all, these were put together for NEFF and its lands. We intend to stay third-party certified. This is not a substitute for that. In terms of the essence of the standards, first of all, it starts from a landscape perspective, and that means thinking about the parcel of land in the context of the landscape where it occurs. If there are some missing pieces of what are needed for wildlife habitat, for example, or parts of the stocking regime that are missing in the landscape, then that would tilt the effort toward filling those voids in what's available. So this one slide is the essence of what we're aiming for. Growing species best suited to each site, beeline stalking on average, and that's across the parcel, and indeed should be achieved for the landscape as a whole, even though we can't control all of that. Growing and harvesting more wood, that specifically not only growing but harvesting more wood, and we're aiming for a half a cord per acre per year, which is considerably above the New England average. And my understanding from the statistics that Chris has put out is that in fact NEFF is achieving that, so we would aspire over time to go even higher. A diverse stand size class distribution, so this comes out of that report that I know you're all familiar with from Mariko Yamasaki and Richard DeGraff and others, which calls for 5 to 15% of the stands in seedling size, 30 to 40 in saplings and poles, and 40 to 50 in saw timber. And then with a certain proportion of the saw timber stands in large diameter multi-storied stands. So that comes out of that guidebook that DeGraff et al. Put forward a number of years ago on managing land for a mix of wildlife habitat and also timber production. We are also looking to manage for umbrella wildlife species, and we'll get more into that in a few minutes here. But basically, manage for species whose habitat requirements represent the great majority of the native species that are present in the area in question. We specify at least 75%, and we'll talk about those species more a little further along here. And then, of course, protecting soils, riparian areas, aquatic habitats, all of that, and special habitats, rare plant sites, et cetera, that need attention. Attention to visual quality, and that's important because of our social license to practice forestry. What I find is that the reaction that I hear from the public to timber harvesting, and they can drive by many areas that have been harvested with consideration for aesthetic conditions and not even necessarily notice them or feel that they've been improved. But boy, do they notice the places that they see as having been done in a way that was careless and without attention to visual. And they equate visual with wildlife habitat, they equate visual with the quality of the forest environment. And it's the sort of thing that I believe we need to pay a lot more attention to in our practice. And then finally, we're looking to use a mix of management styles. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Seymour and Hunter's work, where they laid out the idea of managing a portion of the landscape very intensively, small portion, having a portion that is in lightly managed or ecological reserves, and then what they call ecological management on the bulk of the landscape. So that in essence is the boiled down version of what we're trying to do. In the case of the Acadian Forest Standards, it's all explained in about a 30-page document, and a lot of the thinking that's expressed in that Acadian version also applies in the Central and Transition Hardwoods. At this point, we recently got some comments on a version that we had shared with our advisory committee, and we're in the process of working through those. Those had to do with oak and white pine silviculture, and are aiming to have these wrapped up. Although they will probably always be and should be a living document, that if we don't learn anything in the next 5, 10, 20 years that would lead us to think differently about some of these topics, then we're not paying attention, in my mind. So with that, let's go back to the previous slide. So with that as background, exemplary forestry is active management that considers the full suite of natural resource values. Next. As I mentioned, it's about producing more and better quality wood, wildlife habitat, and climate mitigation. And specifically, one of the things that we're looking to do is to increase carbon storage on the land, and carbon storage in products, and substitution of wood for other materials as a part of this enterprise. Even though forests affect climate in many ways beyond just carbon, our focus right now, because it's well understood, is the carbon side of things. And then it was interesting to me to find that the Union of Concerned Scientists has been quoted as saying, there's no good source of wood. Okay, so what are you going to do otherwise? You got to use some materials if we're going to meet the needs of our expanding global population. Next. This next slide just shows the area that has been identified as being Acadian forest versus the Central and Transition Hardwoods. So you can see that there are fingers of the Central and Transition Hardwoods that poke up along the riparian zones in particular. So it's not a clear, simple dividing line. And these two sets of standards are intended to be used together, so that if you're in an area that on this map is shown as Central and Transition Hardwoods, but you're in a northern hardwood site, then it's the Acadian Forest Standards that should be a guide to management. Next. Beeline stocking. We're looking to have sites fully stocked, and the analysis that we've done, we're not done with the full analysis in the Central and Transition Hardwoods, but it seems to be working out about the same, somewhat to my surprise, as in the Acadian Forest. And that is, if you look at the stand size class distribution, which I talked about earlier, and then beeline stocking, it works out to be about 25 cords per acre. Next. And important in our work on the Acadian Forest and also in the Central Hardwoods, Central and Transition Hardwoods, is the relationship between stocking and how much timber you can grow and harvest. Now, you guys in the Central and Transition Hardwoods are in the enviable position of having high stocking, which is not the case uniformly across the Acadian Forest. So your stands can grow and you can harvest more timber sustainably on a sustained yield basis than in a stand with lower stocking. Next. More timber in the forest and in products. Next. Better timber. Did some calculations a while ago of the comparative value of good highest quality wood versus lower quality wood, and pretty clear, as you all know, the values in the highest quality wood. Next. As to the aesthetic side of things, these pictures represent the kind of forestry that we're seeing as dominant under exemplary forestry. So the slide on the left is before thinning. The slide in the middle is after thinning. And then the complement to the thinning in order to regenerate the stands is the creation of small patches, which is shown on the right. So exemplary forestry, for the most part, in terms of silviculture, is a combination of small patches and then thinning between the stands when you re-enter to create the next set of patches. Next. This is a shot of a stand not in the Central and Transition Hardwoods, but on the Penobscot Experimental Forest, where diameter limit harvesting was used, and work at that site suggested a couple things. One, after a number of years, it may be quite a while before this site is ready to harvest again. And also there's some suggestion that the genetics of the stand may have been compromised as the result of the harvesting practices. So we're not looking to create conditions like those that are shown here. Next. So talked about stand size, class distribution, seedlings, saplings, and saw timber. You guys are in a situation where you have a lot of saw timber stands. You don't have much in the way of seedlings. So a challenge is how to create habitats that are needed by those species that need seedlings size stands. In the case of the Acadian Forest, the percentage of the landscape that's occupied by saw timber stands is well below what the ecologists have recommended. So there's a challenge there to try and grow stands to larger sizes. Next. Umbrella species, scarlet tanager, needs closed crown forests. I'm not a wildlife biologist, but that's what the wildlife biologists tell me. It's one of the species that we've chosen to use. In every case, we've used 3 different species to represent the needs for mature forest, early successional forest, and for edge species. Next. So we do need early successional forest, and we need habitats for edge species as well. Interestingly, one of the species that we chose to use for the edge, or one of the groups of species, are bumblebees. And so looking to meet habitat needs, not just for, I was once accused of only being interested in shootable wildlife. So this is living proof that there are other things that concern us. Next. Protection of water quality, of course. Next. Special habitats, rare plant sites, small areas of old growth forests that are encountered within the matrix of working lands. Again, this is not about ecological reserves. Next. And from a climate perspective, here's the payoff. And this is as regards the Acadian forest in average condition. This is not the circumstances for you guys, but figured you should be aware of it. And so the bar chart there shows the starting condition on the left in the forest of average condition, meaning we took all of the FIA plots in 4.3 million acres and we averaged them. And that's on average what you have, 135 metric tons CO2e per acre. And you can see that over a period of 25 years, you've gained about 35 metric tons per acre of carbon. And it goes up beyond that and then comes back down, but doesn't go below the level where you've gained the 35 metric tons. And this has huge significance because we've looked at the average stocking on private lands in every county in New England. And if you were to restock the areas that fall below the 25 cords per acre that I mentioned earlier, you would remove about 540 million metric tons of CO2e from the atmosphere, and that's equivalent to taking 1 million cars off the road for a century. So this is a huge opportunity to use forests to mitigate climate change. We also did a lot of work in looking at how can you manage heavily stocked stands like those that occur in much of the Central and Transition Hardwoods. And what we found was that even in those stands, if you apply the kind of silviculture that we're talking about, and you go at it thoughtfully, you can, within 30 years, the critical time period for the issue that we're facing, we're told by the scientific community, that you can have a climate beneficial impact while you're producing wood in those heavily stocked stands through the practice of exemplary forestry. So climate mitigation, huge challenge, huge opportunity, opportunities in both northern New England and in southern New England to restock depleted stands and to increase the amount of timber that's produced in other areas. Next. So I mentioned the triad approach, small portion of passively managed areas, meaning small portion of the landscape. As I recall, they were talking 10, 20%. And small portion of the landscape, again, something on the order of 10, 20% in intensively managed areas, and then what I think they termed ecological forestry on the bulk of it. So a three-pronged approach that provides different forest values. Next. So what can we do? We can improve wildlife habitat, including protecting biodiversity. We can protect the full suite of environmental values. We can protect visual quality, and we can produce more and better wood if we apply the techniques that you all know, and we are patient in terms of our approach to improving the quality of stands. And at the same time, perhaps most importantly in today's climate, no pun intended, we can mitigate climate change. Next. This is back to that first slide. I'm not going to go over it again, or not the first slide, the third slide that we talked about. And the alternative is this, which I also showed you before. Now, take note at the bottom here, and this comes from the U.S. Forest Service reports, where they tracked selection management on an adjoining piece of the Penobscot Experimental Forest. And in essence, they found that the cash flows, when you take into account the discount rates from practicing the kind of forestry that's shown here, are about twice as financially beneficial as practicing really careful long-term forest management. And that, as you all know, is our fundamental challenge, that the financial rewards are not aligned with what society would like to see out of our forest resources. And that's an ongoing challenge that we hope we're going to make progress in addressing. Next. So thank you. 70, how many years are we up to now, Bob? Is it 76 we're in? So this is an older slide celebrating NEFFs being around for over 70 years.
78.
78. Okay, great. At this point, Jen, I'm going to turn it over to you. We don't need to go through those last several slides.
Sounds good. And if everyone's okay with it, I'm just going to wrap up our last 5 minutes presentation here, and then we'll jump to the questions that were popping up in the chat for Alec. But we wanted to spend the last few minutes, as Alec said, basically just telling you how we're trying to connect all this work in the forest at NEFF to urban stakeholders for maximum climate benefit. And so here we go. So Alec laid out for us what the big picture in terms of what exemplary forestry is all about. And you saw one of the main goals is climate mitigation. And it raises the question, what is the best way to mitigate climate change with forests? We know there are those out there arguing that we should just leave forests alone and cease all active management. But of course, we would argue, and I imagine most, if not all of you would agree, that that view is fundamentally flawed and incomplete. And that's because to actually solve climate change, we have to use less energy, get that energy from renewables, remove carbon we emitted previously to the atmosphere, transition to more renewable materials, and ultimately move away from the old linear model on the top of take, make, and throw away to the circular economic model you see on the bottom here, which is built on the use of materials that are renewable, recyclable, and preferentially bio-based, like wood. So, you know, climate change is a complex systemic problem. It's like this giant Rube Goldberg machine. And if we only focus on one part of the system, like what you see in this little red box, we can never influence the trajectory of this entire machine. It's really essential, and it's what we've been arguing with a lot of different constituencies, that we need to expand the frame and consider the system in its entirety. Because we need solutions that recognize the reality that our natural, economic, and socio-political systems are actually interconnected. And so when it comes to forests, that of course means considering not only the carbon that's sequestered and stored in living forests, but also the harvested wood products that can actually fuel a circular bioeconomy. And then substitute for more fossil fuel intensive materials, especially in the built environment, like the mass timber building you see here on the right, which may otherwise have been built with concrete and steel, which are two of the most energy intensive industries on the planet. So we can achieve a much bigger climate mitigation benefit with this more holistic approach that combines land conservation and smart growth to stem forest loss with practicing climate smart forestry and using wood products in place of other materials. And you just heard from Alec an articulation of what climate smart forestry can look like, where climate mitigation is a co-equal goal, along with enhancing wildlife habitat and growing more and better quality wood. And then the benefit of long-lived wood products, I'm preaching to the choir here, but they can be used in place of materials that have a much larger carbon footprint and a much more damaging environmental impact from their use and extraction, like plastic and steel and concrete, all while you're storing carbon in the product itself for the long term. And we've actually done some analysis at NEFF to put numbers on what carbon benefit we could achieve with this sort of whole system approach. And that's what you see here, the metric tons of CO2 that could be saved over 30 years. And you can see the exemplary forestry approach makes a huge difference, especially when it's done in concert with these other elements of no net loss of forests and replacing concrete and steel construction with mass timber buildings that store carbon. And we found that doing this at scale across New England would get us a third of the way to net zero emissions by 2050. There are other groups working on similar analyses right now with many of the same components, including Hysted Foundation, and they're coming up with very similar numbers. So the potential here is pretty big. So the question then becomes, well, how do you build a truly climate smart mass timber supply chain that links all of these elements? And that's what we're working toward with NEFF's Forest to Cities Climate Challenge, which is an effort to work with the stakeholders from the grow, build, and live sectors, as we've broadly defined them, to connect more sustainable building in our cities with the local forests that generate the wood for them. And so the goal with the effort is to really deliver a win for climate and forests and communities by building what is essentially a coalition of unusual partners that understand and influence different segments of the supply chain. Because we're trying to work toward a supply chain that delivers benefits for people and the environment really from start to finish. And we've mapped out what the barriers are that we need to overcome to achieve this. And the Forest to Cities community decided collectively that addressing the lack of awareness about the benefits of mass timber and really renewable wood products in general was a near-term priority. So we actually convened the Forest to Cities participants in over several meetings in 2021, identified what those key barriers were and some near-term solutions, and then formed a couple of action groups of volunteers to really focus on outreach and communications. And as soon as we're done, I'll drop a link in the chat to a blog post that has more detail on all that activity. But I just encourage any of those of you who haven't yet to consider joining this effort. There are various ways to engage and learn, and there's there's a growing number of ways to actually take action to kind of move the needle on this vision. If you're interested, the next step is to really visit the Forest to Cities website and sign the pledge that you see here. This pledge is really sort of the common ground on which we are building some pretty powerful cross-sector partnerships with everyone from boots on the ground foresters to big city architects. I mean, it really is a very diverse coalition. And I think the more voices involved that really understand the forest resource, the better. So thank you. I'll wrap there and we can turn to questions.
Thanks so much, Alec and Jen. Certainly covered a lot of ground. It's really interesting to get some detail on these forestry standards for the region, in which we live and work, and how they're part of the puzzle in how forests can play such a big role in mitigating and also adapting to climate change in our region. And we have a few minutes. I don't know that we'll be able to get to everybody's question. Some of them may be covered by our next presenter, but wanted to try to address some of these. And for Alec, we got a question from Ernest or Carl, just requesting some clarification on defining an irregular shelter wood and what that is.
Okay, so if you're familiar with Bob Seymour's work up on the Penobscot Experimental Forest, and Ernest, I believe you've seen that. It's what is called not only irregular shelter wood, but also Femmelschlag. And it's been demonstrated on the Penobscot Experimental Forest, and now organizations like the Appalachian Mountain Club are practicing it on their lands up east of Greenville, Maine. So it's small gaps, and the gaps could be tailored to the specific species that and mix of species that you want to reproduce. And then with thinning in the stand between the gaps that are created. And the gaps can be expanded or they can be put side by side. I think under the traditional Femmelschlag, it was expanding the initial gaps that you created and also going back into those gaps and doing pre-commercial thinning to try and favor the species that you desire. the mix of species that you desire and the most vigorous trees within those species.
That's helpful, Alex. Thanks.
Thanks. So following up on that, Alec, you spoke to the, to the triad, and how, that might be applied across the landscape. Does, NEFF, recommend, particular, percentages in the, the different, types of land management across the landscape? Is that something you could address?
We're not currently practicing the triad. I'm including it there to get people to think about the value of those three different forms of management. So for example, let's take, and there are fans and detractors of the management that Irving performs in its clear-cut areas. But long story short, they have shown, and they've said publicly, that they can produce wood 6 times as fast in those areas as they can using other methods. And so the question for society eventually is going to be, do you want to have some areas, presumably on the best quality sites, where you really focus on producing maximum volume of wood? Another example would be Bob Seymour's low density pine, where he recommends reducing the number of trees per acre with really big crowns down to something that, a few decades ago, people would have said, nah, it's not the way to manage pine. But do you really, is it best for society to have a small proportion of the area, high quality sites that's really devoted to producing a lot of wood, which can enable you to then back off on the intensity of management in other areas? It's not something that we're explicitly doing currently, but I want to prompt people to think about it.
So we've got a couple of wildlife related questions. I'll just throw them both out to you here, since we don't have too much time. But a question about the different age classes of forests, and how they're distributed across the landscape, particularly here in the southern New England states, and if you've given thought to that in developing these standards, what the ideal arrangement might be. And then we have another question, wondering about the success of being able to regenerate forests using small openings down here in the southern New England, with the high deer populations and heavy deer herbivory that we have in many places.
Yeah, so let me address the second one first. Actually, this is one of the questions that Jeff Ward raised with us with the draft of the standards that we circulated around. And we're going to be modifying what we had sent out earlier and saying, you've got to adjust what you do to deal with the circumstances that you find in particular areas. And in some places, you may have to increase the size of the openings just to sort of to deal with the herbivory problem. So you're never going to have something that works in every place, and that's not our intention. Of course, you need to modify things to be adapted to the circumstances in the place where you find it. Oh, and by the way, we do call for the creation of larger gaps as well, but recognize that those probably aren't going to be typical in southern New England, but they are needed by a variety of different species that need those early successional habitats. So we're not saying that it's strictly the small openings, but that's going to be the bulk of the management. With regard to the question of can you regenerate things successfully, one of the benefits, as I understand it, of the small gaps, the Femmelschlag, is that you get a mix, because it is a small gap, you get a mix of conditions for regenerating the stand. So you're likely to get a more diverse mix of species. You'll have things that are more shade tolerant along the southern edge, where it gets sheltered by the trees that are left in the overstory. And then the intolerant species more out in the open. So the answer to the question, based on what I have seen, is yes. And again, we were in conversations with Jeff about his comments, talking about how can you regenerate red oak under these circumstances, or oak generally under these circumstances, and believe that it can be done successfully.
Thanks, Alec, for your thoughtful answers, and to both of you for your presentation. I think we are going to need to move on to the next presenter at this point, but can tell, from the number of questions and comments in the chat that there's a lot of interest in these standards as they're being rolled out, and I dare say we'll have opportunity to learn more about them at places like the upcoming NEFF meeting and other venues in Southern New England. So really appreciate your being up for presenting them to us this afternoon.
Thank you for the opportunity.
And with that, we are going to move on to hearing about managing for forest carbon from Joseph Orefice, who's a lecturer and the director of forest and agricultural operations at the Yale School of the Environment. Certainly there's a lot about forest